Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. This is going to be my discussion on the Reckoning of Roku Barnes & Noble's exclusive edition, the extra content in it, which is it's a cut scene or a cut chapter of the book. It's a 7-page chapter called Our Deepest Wounds, and then there's also a note from Randy Rabai at the start explaining some context, why it was cut, that sort of thing. So there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff in this. This is not like a random chapter. This is actually a pretty notable cut chapter here that actually has quite a lot of stuff that I'm guessing a lot of people, a few people I've discussed it with already, feel like, why wasn't this actually featured in the book? But we'll get into that in the discussion here. So what Randy Rabai has to say at the start here is that this scene is basically the night before the equinox. So it's right before Roku and Ulo are going to go to Yungib to have the ritual happen, and before Malaya and Gyatso go to deal with the kind of conflict that's happening between the clan and the Earthbenders. We established that one different thing that happens in the version of the book that includes this cut scene versus the final version of the book is that what happens in the actual book is that when Gyatso and Malaya find Roku, they have a quick scene, but ultimately the end of that scene is Roku deciding that he needs to go back to Ulo so he doesn't raise any suspicions. In this version, that scene leads to Roku going with Malaya and Gyatso and actually kind of staying away from Ulo overnight, before, I'm guessing, eventually making his way back after all the chaos and stuff like that. Because I'm assuming the end of the book is still meant to happen in roughly the same way. So this is why, sort of canonically, we can't just say that, oh, this scene did just also happen in the book, because there's no spot for it anymore because of the way the final version of the book is done. He explains that he likes the character interaction in this scene and it's reminiscent of 305, The Beach, but he says that basically the reason it was cut is that it ultimately slowed the momentum down too much at a point in the story where he wanted to ramp up the pace. I'm not sure I quite agree with that reasoning for it, that being like one of the main criticisms of it, because I really feel like if this was included there, I would have greatly valued the character development that we got in this scene over any sense of like it's slightly slowing down the pacing, just because like it's a YA book, it's already relatively fast paced, and sorry, like even like a 7-page chapter, which is I guess on the longer side for this book, is not so much of a distraction from what's happening that I'd have a major issue with it. I can see other reasons for potentially why the scene was actually cut, and we'll get to that as we go through it here. So what we get here is, of course, Roku wakes up. Of course, Gyatso and Malaya are meant to be there, but he notices they're not there. Like Malaya's bow is there on the ground, Gyatso's left his pack there. So he's kind of thinking about like, oh, like where are they? But also realizes, oh, I've only gotten a few hours of sleep, but I feel really, really refreshed. And they kind of allude to the idea of like away from Ulo, he seems more refreshed, alluding to the idea of the kind of tea that Ulo is using to kind of poison Roku and keep his energy low for a few days. He hears laughing in the distance and kind of follows it over to where there's a stream, and next to the stream, Malaya and Gyatso are about to have a kind of non-bender sparring match. She notes that like, don't cheat this time, and Gyatso's like, okay. They have their sparring match. Malaya ends up winning by getting a hit on Gyatso's back, and he's about to fall over, but he uses airbending to keep himself upright, and she's like, hey, you used your airbending again. He says he didn't, and this is when Roku introduces himself and is like, yeah, you definitely cheated, and we kind of start the conversation properly from here, that like they came out here to get water, but they got a bit distracted, and they get to discussing just a lot of the basic stuff of like, they ask Roku, are you ready to face Ulo yet? He hopes he doesn't have to fight him, that sort of thing. Don't trust him, he's still a powerful waterbender even away from the sacred cave. An interesting detail that comes up is Gyatso says, your tribe won't kill Roku if he figures out a way to stop your chief and convinces Youngib to move elsewhere. And she's like, probably not. And Roku's like, wait, what? Like, if I have to defeat your chief, the tribe actually won't be annoyed at me? And she says, people are too afraid to say it out loud, but I think most of us don't actually like Ulo as our chief. And when we tell them all his lies, they might not want to remain completely isolated from the rest of the world anymore, which is a very interesting detail that I maybe wish the book had gone into a little bit more. They sort of do it in the actual book because the transition from one chief to the other does happen quite smoothly and quickly in terms of the resolution of things here. I think Baku takes over as chief, and it seems like he's just immediately going to take the clan in a different direction. So Ulo very much was the bad influence in a way over the clan up top. It just would have been nice to see more characters directly kind of allude to that, whereas I would say I think the first scene with Malaya where she's talking to Baku is maybe one of the only times you see someone else really criticize Ulo. But he then returns the favor and is like, hey, what about you guys? Are you ready for what you're going to have to do in the Grove, dealing with the Earthbenders and the clan? And they're like, we're going to keep everyone alive, basically. That's that. Roku then asks, basically, what did you two get up to? You seem quite close, even though you've only kind of, been around each other for a while. And so they reveal they've been talking to each other about everything. Malaya's been telling me what life was like with her clan, and Gyatso's been teaching me about air nomad culture, and she says to Roku, did you know they don't have parents? And Roku thinks to himself, do I know that? I've been living with them for a while. I guess it's true, but I haven't really thought about it. And Gyatso clarifies, and it's really interesting what we get here, because like this is something we know about in terms of air nomad culture, but they've never gone into the details of it like they do in this sequence here. So there's some interesting world building here that I guess you have to view as being at least, partially canonical, just because even though we can't say that this scene necessarily happened in the book, this is like content that they are presenting to us that, like, I guess, is still usable, to a certain degree. Gyatso says, I never said we don't have parents. I know who brought me and Yama into this world. So straight away, that line is very interesting because it's confirming that Gyatso and Yama are biological siblings, which I don't believe is ever really clarified specifically in the book, in that I went through the entire book assuming that when Gyatso said his sister Yama, he did mean it in the air nomad way, where it's a very close friend who they're not actually related, but he views as being his sister, in the same way that like Yang Chen and Jetson are sisters. So this being here is like, why didn't you clarify this here? And I can maybe understand this from the perspective of maybe the writer was going with the idea, well, I wrote in that it was his sister, not realizing that with air nomads, you probably do need to very much clarify the point for this exact reason of this world building detail of how air nomad society kind of works when it comes to family. But it is cool because I think this is pretty much the only like clear confirmation that Yama is his actual biological sister here. Not that it really changes much, I suppose, but it's a nice detail to actually know. Just the idea that, oh, Gyatso knows who his actual parents are, has an actual sister, but I guess his sister is much more involved in his life than his actual parents. It's that when airbenders say family, the word is wider than how people from the other nations mean it. We don't have the concept of children belonging to their parents. Instead, we view raising children as the entire community's responsibility. Roku asks, how does that actually work? And he's fascinated about this because it's so different than Fire Nation culture in this regard, because family legacy is everything in the Fire Nation. Gyatso says it's pretty simple. Everyone shares responsibilities around the temple, even the little ones. We take meals together. Nobody's sleeping quarters are fixed, basically. And then they get to asking, like, hey, so does that mean you don't feel anything towards your parents? What do you mean by that? Like, and Roku says, love, I guess. And he says, we love everyone in our community. But if you specifically mean, do we feel any sort of special affection towards those who gave us life? It depends. Some do, some don't. There's no obligation or judgment either way, and every child finds the right adult or elder to mentor them eventually. That's really nice. I like that idea. That's like a really nice way to word it as well. It's like some people do know and have like a close relationship with their actual parent. Others don't really. But the way it does work is that the kind of parental figure that we know for, like, say, Gyatso and Aang and stuff like that, in a way, Jetson and Yang Chen, that is not just a thing that happens to happen every so often. No, it's sort of the intent of the way that this works, is that, yeah, there is meant to be a sense of, an adult does become the sort of actual mentor, kind of parental figure to one young air nomad. So interesting detail there. Is that to encourage detachment? That's part of it, but it's more about building the kind of community where everyone cares about each other out of intention instead of obligation, which I think is another nicely worded kind of detail there. And Roku's like, you make much more sense now that I understand that detail. But he goes on and says this, and this is where we maybe get into the beach thing of, like, it is the characters sort of almost like psychoanalyzing each other's character arcs. After Yama died, the air monks encouraged you to detach from your sister, from your grief. That didn't work for you like it might for other air nomads. Instead, it filled you with anger and caused you to question everything. You need connection. And then Gyatso kind of reacts to this and then switches attention to Roku and is like, so what's family like in the Fire Nation? And we get to addressing Roku's relationship with his parents. This is maybe the section where maybe you don't need to go into it as much. Like, this whole idea that, like, Roku reacts to just this detail, like world building detail of Gyatso just helping him to get up to speed on air nomad culture, and then is like, oh, and now let me explain what your character arc is to the reader. That's, I think, maybe the part of this chapter that isn't quite needed as much. I always appreciate it when, you can make it clear without needing to just outright state this is the intent of the character arc. But anyway, we'll see this happen again, and I think, like I said, this is, I think, the main reason I'd be like, okay, I can maybe see why every aspect of this chapter wasn't just kept in to a certain degree. So in the narration it says here, Roku, he thought of the way his parents never forgave him for Yasu's death. He thought of Ta Min's father pressuring her to marry Sozin. He thought of Fire Lord Taiso constantly putting Sozin down in some twisted attempt to mold his son into his own image. It depends on one's parents. What are yours like? And Roku explains here, and this is interesting because the whole Roku and his parents dynamic, what's present in the book, I think, works. I think what we get here highlights that I'm guessing this cutscene also links into other potential cutscenes, or they altered it based on this to be something slightly different, as we'll sort of see. So, but this first part, I think it makes sense as just a little bit of extra context. They used to be very traditional. My father oversaw the clan's business dealings, so he wasn't around very much. My mother managed the household and the servants, so she was around, but in an indirect kind of way. Malaya asks what that means, and Roku says, unlike our father, she was always present for dinner, but it's not like she cooked. And Malaya's like, wait, maybe she just doesn't like to cook. Like, what are you trying to say here, Roku? I didn't mean anything against her for not literally cooking. I was only trying to give an example. I mean, she was there every night, but she didn't know our favorite dishes. The cooks did. And Gyatso kind of interprets this in more of the way that, like, it's meant to be interpreted. So you're saying, you don't think she really knew you, basically. Like, your own mother didn't have enough role in your life to know those little details about you, like what food you actually liked. There was a bit of a disconnect there. Right. And so, she says, okay, you said they used to be like that. What happened? And so he explains, my brother Yasu was swept out to sea one night while we were swimming, and afterwards my parents both fell apart. When they eventually put themselves back together, it was like they decided to focus all their energy on me. And this is the new dynamic here, where I don't remember any part in the book where they alluded to this being the dynamic with Roku and his parents after Yasu's death. I more got the impression in the book that it's maybe like the reverse, that post Yasu's death, the family really kind of just almost like gave up that like Roku is the way he is. He is the kind of in a way lesser son, and they just kind of moved away, not expecting much from him, and this is why he doesn't have much of a relationship with his parents. I feel other scenes that are actually present in the book would have alluded to this a little bit more if this was the actual intent. And it goes on and it says here, like, Yasu had always been so good at everything he did. He was liked by everyone. It shielded me in a way. And this is all present. I think this is perfectly fine, because we got the idea that actually initially I think it was Yasu and Sozin who had the stronger relationship. Yasu was the more outgoing, popular, the better one ultimately. They had a perfect son, so it was okay if the other left something to be desired. He was the one who was meant to inherit everything. After he was gone, they tried to turn me into him. Like it was the only way they could forgive me for that night. I tried my best, and I'd been doing a passable job, at least on the outside. And then Gyatso says, now you make more sense to me. Because, and he explains, you've been struggling to see yourself as the Avatar because you've spent so much You've been struggling to see yourself as the Avatar because you've spent so long trying to be someone else to please your parents. Then you felt like you had to be another someone else to please the world. You've never been allowed to figure out who you actually are. And that's actually it. And then the attention turns to Malaya after this. Again, how much of this is actually present in the actual book versus how much of this is a slightly different angle on Yasu, I'm not exactly sure. Whereas like the stuff of like, say, like Yama being Gyatso's like actual sister, I don't mind interpreting that as being kind of canon. Would I necessarily add all this stuff in for Roku, given what's present in the book? That's where I'm kind of not so like sure about necessarily. Like, is this meant to be part of the intent? I think the book needs a little bit more to like connect the dots from that to this. Now, I will say straight away, I probably do need to read some of the, especially the second half of the book in a little bit more detail to maybe latch on to more of the Yasu connection moments. But I'm pretty sure nothing otherwise in the book gives you the suggestion that the parents try to morph Roku into the new Yasu. I don't think that's necessarily the idea really overall. But if that was the intent, like obviously Gyatso's interpretation here is pretty interesting, but it is also the thing of like it's Gyatso explaining Roku's character arc in exact detail, which works in the beach because you don't actually know Mei that well, you don't actually know Tai Li that well in terms of those details about their past. Even Azula, it is a new angle on the character within that episode, and then it's super important within the beach for Zuko to be like, I'm angry at myself. So the beach is like an extremely important episode to go in depth on the characters. This one maybe not as much. They maybe go, each section maybe goes like a little bit too much into this is what the character motivation type thing is. But an altered version of this chapter I think could absolutely have been kept in the book and probably would have added some nice detail to the book ultimately. But anyway, we switch to Malaya. And she eventually kind of shares and it's just like, I will. In the clan, we're like a combination of what you each described. Children live with their families but share in the clan's responsibilities, and when they come of age, Ulo determines how each will serve the community for the rest of their life. So you didn't choose to be a scout? No, but I would have, to get away from my parents. What was so bad about them? And she doesn't really answer, and the silence here is interpreted by Roku as being, that means it must be similar to what I described with my own parents, but almost worse. And Gyatso picks up, because Gyatso knows Malaya more, so kind of probably knows what she's talking about. And he says, you're a survivor, Malaya. You spent your life learning and adapting and doing what was necessary to stay alive. All that hurt you in ways you were never allowed to say. But your spirit needs more than simply to survive. What does it need? To belong. You should come with us back to the Southern Air Temple. Roku suggests this. And Gyatso and Malaya are like, really? And he says, yeah, I'm serious. Like, why not? And then he's like, and she agrees, like, yeah, I would actually like that. That this is a new path for her because she doesn't feel the connection really to the clan anymore after all the lies, and would like to know about the outside world, of course. That's the intent of the character arc. But then Roku says, but know that romances between companions of the Avatar have always led to serious complications. And the two of them just start laughing, and Gyatso says, I had to watch you drool all over Ta Min. Don't even start. And that's where the chapter ends. So, we know, obviously, canonically why it can't kind of just fit in, but there's definitely some details there that I think are interesting. Confirmation, of course, of Yama being Gyatso's like actual biological sister is interesting and nice to know, even if it doesn't, I guess, change too much about what the arc actually is. I really like the exploration of a more detailed insight into sort of how exactly kind of the communal raising of the kids within the air nomads actually works. And then even the Roku and his parents stuff, I think is interesting, because while I am guessing in this case it probably is taken in a slightly different direction in a previous draft than what's present. I do think what's present in the book is a little bit of a more simple arc, where like at the funeral it's more the idea of his parents go up to him and say, you could have saved him, and it's this moment of just his parents were not there for him over the loss of his brother, and that created a rift between the two of them, rather than like I said, I really didn't get much of a sense that like the intent of this arc was that the parents then try to morph Roku into Yasu. I didn't get that like at all. But that's where this is from a previous version of the book that included this chapter, where that was the intent. So that's like slightly different, of course. So, and then Malaya and her parents is also interesting. Of course, even this chapter, the cut chapter here, doesn't go into too much detail on it, but it's a little bit more detail than is present in the book. And this was a little bit more on the really vague side in what's left in the book, in terms of, what is the clan's dynamic when it comes to families? Is this something unique to Malaya, or is this just the way it is on the clan, where like you don't have this like extreme closeness with your family, that part of how the clan works is kind of in a way almost meant to separate you from your kind of family, and that's maybe how Ulo keeps control by having family units not be as closely tightly knit as they maybe could be, and that whole idea. And you can get the idea of that, but it's meant to be a little bit of a mix, like they kind of address here, mix of Fire Nation stuff with some of the Air Nomad stuff, and for Malaya it working out kind of worse for her kind of overall, and that the idea seems to be that she always had to do everything on her own, and kind of in a way didn't get the support from her parents, but was pressurized about a lot of things while never actually getting any like proper support. So all the kind of worst aspects of this stuff, that's the idea there. So I think even in both versions of the story, that's something that, I would have liked to be fleshed out a bit more, but overall, quite interesting here. So in this one, I'm very interested to see what your guys' thoughts are. What from this chapter would you say should be considered like canon and like useful going forward, versus what is just sort of almost like an artifact from a previous iteration of the book? And would you have liked a chapter along the lines of this to be included? Do you agree with the author's idea there that it was mainly for the kind of plot momentum that this needed to be cut, or do you have a different reason for kind of seeing why it was cut? But I definitely think it's a pretty interesting chapter. It's more thought-provoking than certain chapters in the book for certain, but I think that's just the thing with all the books, that since the Rise of Kyoshi we've had under 400 page books. Rise of Kyoshi was over 400 pages, and I think a lot of them could do with being a little bit longer or a little bit more in depth, but that's just my thoughts on it. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on this cut chapter, but otherwise that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.